Welcome back, guys. We are into our sixth unit of world history now. We've left World War I behind, and now we're going to focus in our sixth unit on something known as interwar changes, or the interwar period. And what that refers to is simply the time between World War I and World War II. It turns out there was a lot of things going on in that time period that are pretty important for establishing what's going to happen after World War I, and then also what's going to happen kind of later in the 20th century, and even in the modern day. So here's a little bit of a preview of what we're going to cover in this unit. We're going to look at how Africa, the Middle East, China, and India are all changing. And we're also going to focus on the Great Depression and some big social changes going on between the wars. Today, however, we're going to focus on the role of nationalism, and we're going to apply nationalism to Africa and the Middle East. So let's begin by looking at South Africa. And when I say South Africa, I don't mean the region, as in like the southern part. I mean literally the country of South Africa. And South Africa is a rather unique country in Africa. And we're going to look at why it's unique. And we're also going to look at the role of something called apartheid. That's the A word on your screen there, apartheid. So to understand what apartheid was, we need to focus on a little bit of history, a little bit of background on South Africa. So I mentioned South Africa as a country is rather unique, and what made it unique was going back to the 16 and 1700s, a fair number of Europeans arrived to settle in South Africa, okay, mainly from the Netherlands, later quite a few British people as well. In other words, it was a white population that moved to Africa. And, you know, their descendants live there still to the present day. And even though they are not a majority, they're a relatively small minority in South Africa, they had all the political and economic power. And the goal of this racial segregation system they're going to establish is to make sure that the white minority of South Africa continues to rule over the country and have kind of the final say in what goes on there. And so as a consequence, the rights of the native black population of South Africa were reduced over time. And in 1948, which I realize is a little bit beyond the time period of what we're looking at right now, but we're going to, kind of set the stage for that. In 1948, South Africa established a new series of laws called apartheid. Now, apartheid translates as separateness, okay, segregation in other words. So the goal was to keep the white and non-white population of South Africa separate. And obviously you can draw parallels between this and the segregation that took place in America after the Civil War all the way up until the 1960s. Now, I thought I'd share an example of what I'm talking about with separateness, the separation of the races. You may have never heard of this guy. His name is Trevor Noah. He's a he's a comedian who was born in South Africa, grew up there. He hosts the Daily Show now on Comedy Central, and he wrote a memoir, okay, kind of like an autobiography, and he titled it Born a Crime. And the reason he chose that title was because of apartheid in South Africa. Whites and blacks were not allowed to intermarry. They weren't allowed to have relationships. And it turns out that his father was white and his mother was black. And so because of that mixed ancestry, technically his birth was a crime against the apartheid system. Now, if you think about this, guys, again, the black population of South Africa are the majority. They're being oppressed by a minority. I think we know what feelings would probably be growing here, and it's our old friend nationalism. So black nationalism in South Africa grows, and it fuels protests against the segregation system of apartheid. And this movement culminates in the establishment of a political party called the African National Congress, or ANC for short. And the ANC will eventually be banned by the white government of South Africa, and it will, kind of continue in the shadows. Many of its members were sent to prison, such as this guy down here, Nelson Mandela, the most famous South African probably of all time, and a man we will come back and revisit later this year. Apartheid would continue being the law of the land in South Africa all the way until 1990. And I realize 1990 for you guys, it seems like forever ago, but really in the grand scheme of things in world history, that really is like practically yesterday. So this is still a recent change in South Africa where apartheid finally came to an end. All right, so let's move away from South Africa. We're going to head up north to a region called Palestine, and right there in the Middle East. And to understand what happens next, we need to go back to World War I for just a moment. Well, you might remember during World War I, quite a few Arabs in the Middle East had rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, and they were doing so with British help because they assumed that when World War I would come to an end, they would get independence for their efforts. But of course, as we found out, that is not what happened. At the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, the Arabs had to settle for not independence, but these things called mandates. And these mandates were basically colonies. Okay, they were basically colonies where the Europeans would continue to rule over the Middle East. So Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine would be British mandates or colonies, and then Lebanon and Syria would be French mandates. Again, mandates are basically colonies. Now, in particular, guys, right here in Palestine, this is where we're going to see a clash between Jews and Arabs. And these Jewish nationalists were known as Zionists. So let's talk a little bit about Zionism as a review from last semester, and then kind of talk about why there's a conflict there in the first place. So to understand what happened in the early 20th century, we have to go back to ancient history to understand what happened in Palestine. So if you remember back to 6th grade, you learned about ancient history and the rise of these religions like Islam and Judaism and so forth. And what you might remember is that Jews once ruled right here in Palestine, and then over the years, many of them were forced out. It's called the Jewish diaspora. Diaspora is just a fancy word for basically the scattering of the people across the world. And so Jews moved away, and many of them went to Europe. Some of them eventually, much later, came to America. And there were a few pockets of Jews here and there. And these Jews always had this dream of one day returning to Palestine to establish a Jewish nation state called Israel. The problem with this is in the intervening period between the Jews leaving, a new religion had been established down here called Islam. And Muslims, the Islamic faith is spread across the Middle East. And so this area became solidly Muslim by the early part of the last millennia. Now, if you remember, we also learned that in the 1800s, in Europe in particular, there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is discrimination against Jews. And Jews felt that because they were under threat, no matter where they lived across Europe, that they really had to create their own Jewish state in Palestine where they would be safe. And that movement to create this Jewish state is known as Zionism. So, slowly but surely, thousands of Jews trickle back into Palestine, and that is where that conflict is going to start. This brings us back to World War I. So in World War I, the British were interested in trying to weaken the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire, of course, was part of the Central Powers. And they thought that since Jews lived in Palestine, but also across the world, that to encourage Jews to support the British war effort, they would make a promise of sorts regarding Palestine and Jews. It's called the Balfour Declaration. It's a very, very brief document right here, as you can see. In fact, there is the document. Okay, I would like you to pause the video for a moment and read this very, very brief document. So you've had a chance to read the document. What I want you to do is I want you to focus in on these two phrases right here. He says, His Majesty's government, that's the British government, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so in other words, the British are saying we're in favor of Zionism. We want Jews to return home to Palestine. Then they said, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So in other words, they're saying we want Jews to return to Palestine, create their country, as long as the rights of the people already living in Palestine who are not Jews are, as long as those rights are not violated. Which means, of course, this is really, they're kind of promising two things, right, that conflict. And this British support of a Jewish homeland, as long as it doesn't conflict with non-Jews already there, well, I mean, that is kind of not going to work, right? I mean, this is basically, two people having to share the same land, and, it's just human nature that may not work very well. So let's look at this political cartoon that really refers to this tension that's growing between Arabs living in Palestine and Jews returning to Palestine. And what we have here is a British soldier right there in the middle, and he's kind of holding the Arab back from attacking the Jew, and the Jew looks pretty angry that the Arab's there in the first place. And so there's a lot of tension there. And if you were to remove the British soldier from this cartoon, we know what would happen next. Violence would break out between those two sides. And in fact, that's what's going to happen ultimately, is you're going to have violent confrontations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Now, this situation will later morph into the establishment of Israel, and that situation of Palestinian Arabs and Jewish Israel, that really still hasn't been fully resolved, even in the modern day. So this is a topic we're going to come back to and talk a lot about later this year. Okay, last topic we're going to focus on today is the Ottoman Empire being replaced by something called the Republic of Turkey. So think back to World War I, and the Ottoman Empire, if you recall, had been part of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Ottoman Empire. And we also learned that, of course, the Central Powers lost that war. And the Germans were punished, the Austrian Empire was broken up. What about the Ottoman Empire? What's going to happen to that empire? And if you remember, we called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe for a reason. It was, in the process of falling apart and collapsing, and World War I really is the final straw. And so as World War I comes to an end, a group of Turkish nationalists led by a guy named Mustafa Kemal overthrows the last Ottoman Sultan, and Turkey becomes a republic. So the Ottoman Empire, after many, many centuries of existence, dies. The sick man in Europe is now dead. So what is going to happen with this new country that comes out of the Ottoman Empire called Turkey? Well, it's going to be modernized under Mustafa Kemal's leadership. And we'll get to his modernizations in a moment, but because he really is the founder of modern Turkey, he's seen as a hero to the Turkish people, and he had people called him Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. He's kind of like the George Washington of Turkey, if you will. So what modernizations does Kemal bring to Turkey? Well, he's going to give women the right to vote, which was revolutionary, particularly in this part of the world. That was just way ahead of its time. He is going to separate the dominant religion of Turkey, which is Islam, from the government, so that there's a secular government. Again, that was very unusual in this part of the world. And I think very interestingly, he changes the alphabet of his country. So the Turkish language used to use sort of the Arabic alphabet. You've seen Arabic, you know what it looks like. It's a very flowing type, almost like calligraphy. That is going to be switched out, and they're going to begin using the Latin alphabet. That looks pretty familiar to you because we use the Latin alphabet today. And the reason he chose this was he was trying to tie Turkey more closely to Europe. And he felt that if Turkey used the same alphabet that most countries in Europe use, then it would kind of, draw Turkey closer. It would make it easier for people to trade with Turkey, and it would just kind of modernize and help Turkey blend in better with Europe. Okay, so let's think about what we covered today. We looked at apartheid in South Africa, which was racial segregation separating the white minority and the black majority. We looked at the Balfour Declaration, where the British basically promised Palestine to two different conflicting groups, Arab Palestinians and then the Jewish Zionists. And we also looked at Mustafa Kemal as Ataturk, father of the Turks, establishing a new independent Republic of Turkey and beginning a process of modernization. All right, so that is it for our topic today. And in our next video, we're going to continue looking at nationalism and how it affects the countries around Asia and Africa and other places of the world.